appear. Say hi, everyone. Okay. Good. Well, thank you for coming, you guys. Yeah.
We wouldn't miss it.
Well, I was going to say, although we have the small numbers here, but I could say, so you each have about at least 10 slides each that I've produced. I think, they're personal for you, John. I'll let you know as we move on to Alison's personal slides.
I know of a couple of people who may watch from All Saints.
Oh, is that right?
So
there you go.
We'll see whether anything comes of that.
Got to ring John Graffin, didn't
Yeah.
Oh well.
Yeah.
But the nice thing is they're all stacking up online for anyone who watch. Yeah.
You can't tell how many are watching, can you?
In theory, I can. Yes. Well, I don't know. I don't know how you can see. You can see how many watch the stream, and then I edit the file to trim off the beginnings where I'm just rambling, and then we can see how many watch the two. But so they add them together. Anyway, let's pray.
Yeah.
Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I think about and John writes that I suppose if everything that you did was written down, the world wouldn't contain the books. And the amazing thing is, the things that you did, we never exhaust exploring them, Lord Jesus. That there is kind of, it's like the. Sorry, I ramble as I pray, but it feels to me it's like the fjords, which is the Norwegian coastline, just goes on and on forever and ever. You just look deeper detail and you find there's more curves and more inlets and more and so they say if you try and measure it, you just can't, and it so often it feels like that to me as I sit down and look again, and you think, oh, I never saw that before, I never saw that before, I never saw that before. It just goes deeper and deeper. And so Jesus, we do it not because we're going to finish the task, but because it feeds us. It nourishes the soul. And so we look for that tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So we're on to number 4. That sounded like somebody arriving.
Did it?
Yeah, oh look.
Oh.
We were just about to start and here. No, come on in.
No, stay.
You can squeeze in. Now the only thing to be careful of, John, is there's a video camera just sitting there by your shoulder. It will be.
Well, you can sit
No,
there.
come on. No. Oh no.
No, Alison is quite happy.
Why do you want to
I like sitting at the back.
Okay, you like being at the back. Okay. Does that go back to school days, Alison?
You sat there, haven't got your pea shooter.
Yeah. You're suddenly thinking back to what.
Would you say something?
Yeah.
When do people get to know that we're actually on air? Or do they know?
They are now watching.
Yeah, we are now
They've watched the arrival of
Oh dear.
John.
Oh dear.
Yes.
Apologies.
There you go. But it is delightful to have you.
What is the picture you put on WhatsApp?
Don't know.
It's a thing like a mug.
Oh, it came on. I wondered if that had happened.
This is going to be really riveting for those watching.
I just put
watching the streaming. You moved on to that, so we're not. Yeah. So we literally just started. So we're just saying. So we're on to week 4 of the Sermon on the Mount. So we're looking at Blessed are the Merciful, because they will receive mercy. Why is this? What I wanted to do, I remember last time we spent a long time on what I thought would just be a few short verses, which is about the pure in heart. And I realised as soon as I got home that the actual verses that Jesus uses to expound the phrase "blessed are the pure in heart," we had actually only done the ones which are about to do with kind of sexuality and sexual relationships, and actually how often the kind of the loss of sight of the divine actually leads us to a place where in the end all that people have left is the sexual. And we didn't touch on the next half of the verses, and so I just thought it makes sense, and it also sets a little bit of context as we kind of run into Blessed are the Merciful, just to kind of have a kind of to take a quick kind of conclusion look at what we were looking at last time, which we didn't actually kind of cover. So again, before we Blessed are the merciful, they receive mercy. This is still blessed are the pure in heart, because they'll see God. And so Jesus does go on, which we didn't do last time. Again, you've heard it said of old time, you shan't make false vows. So now he moves very much away. So we've kind of under that umbrella of the pure in heart, we've looked at, if you like, that dimension which is what lifts us from, if you like, the animal of who we are, which is why that's what we tend to fall down to just the sex when it comes to. So as I think I said last time, a friend of mine, David Landry, was the EA's advocacy kind of head of advocacy. He always refers to the secular as the sexular, because it always kind of, that's where it kind of it was where it goes down to once you've lost, if you like, the aspiration of the divine in us trying to reach up, if you like. And so if you break that connection, you tend to go down. But then strangely, the tempo seems to kind of change, and suddenly Jesus is talking kind of about personal honesty, and so he's suddenly talking about, don't make any false vows. You should perform, but shall perform to the Lord your vows. But I tell you, don't swear at all. And he's kind of going back. Obviously, he's referring back to you shan't lie, which is Leviticus. This is Leviticus expounding the Ten Commandments. Do you remember how we said right at the beginning the Beatitudes, 8 statements, and then we have an exposition of them? That follows the same format of the way the Ten Commandments are given, where you have 10 words or statements. Although, as we thought, the 10 is a rather arbitrary number, that they've been grouped in ways that allow you to treat them from anything from 8 to 13 in terms of actually how you group them. But we like the number 10, so that's what we call them, the 10 Commandments, the 10 words. But once you get those 10 kind of top level statements, you get kind of an exposition. So we have our top level statement, blessed are the pure in heart, they will see God. Now this is part of the exposition, but in Leviticus the command is don't bear false witness, and it goes on, you shan't lie, you shan't deceive one another, you'll not swear by my name falsely and profane the name of your God, because I am Yahweh. And in Numbers, when a man vows a vow to Yahweh, it's just reaffirming why it's important, or swears an oath, or to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word, he shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. So it's there as kind of, if you like, part of the legal framework of the Ten Commandments. Leviticus 19. So if you go back, 19:11b. I've got the same. I put the wrong reference. I think it's a little bit later in Leviticus 19, this verse. What's gone from your lips you shall observe to do according to all that you've vowed to Yahweh your God, a freewill offering which you've promised with your mouth. So this is the kind of the context. And the Pharisees, the rabbis, and just the Jewish kind of population in general argued a lot, if I can put it this way, they debated a lot the nuances, and it was normally to do with, as we said when we were looking at last time, it's really to do with what can you get away with. And it actually is an area, because I wanted to always kind of draw how relevant the Sermon on the Mount is. The area, if you like, of what you've said, how much emphasis you have to say it, how you can use the cleverness of words to kind of to make a case. These very things that Jesus is talking about were part of the rabbinic debate, so they were always kind of arguing about when you're being honest and when you're not, effectively. So I thought it's actually very modern. There you go. No sound on it, but it's just reminding that politicians do exactly the same today, which is, we debate as to what's truth, what isn't. I remember actually back in the days when Bill Clinton, who we all thought was terrible, I was going to say not everyone did, but we thought was terrible in his morality in the White House, and nowadays we look in and we think maybe not so bad compared with where we seem to be going nowadays. But I remember that one of the people, sorry, I was just trying to get the picture of him, keeps on talking, it was only there for a smile. There was one of those kind of the pastoral figures that used to kind of meet with him or whatever, talked about how he had a discussion with him about the difference between what's moral and what's legal and the two, and therefore when kind of withholding information is truth. And you can sort of understand from a political point of view, and when I say you can sort of understand, I'm not in any sense diminishing the way Jesus makes it quite clear, if you want. But there's also that place, and the balance is very hard, where it says of Jesus, he withheld himself from people because he knew what was in them, and we all have a context, if that makes sense, to which we're able to share and what we're not. And if you are in a politician and actually in a broken world, you're constantly going to be juggling with these kind of issues as when is the truth, and when did you misspeak and when did you lie. I misspoke when I said we ran across the tarmac being fired at. No, we didn't. I was greeted by a girl with flowers. You remember that? That kind of question though is a constant one that goes around in the modern world. So as I say, we've seen the kind of the context. You've heard it said, but in all of these situations, you'll notice that there's the issues of promises and of oaths. And so just kind of in the general thinking, so you shan't deceive one another, you shall not swear by my name falsely. So there's a full stop there. That's a very good way of doing it in English. But obviously the Hebrew just all runs together. And so the people in Jesus' day were kind of debating the fact that it's only in the context of when you're swearing. It's only when you really mean it that you have to mean it. If that makes sense. So that's the kind of the context that Jesus is speaking into. But Jesus goes on about what you're swearing by. He says, neither by heaven, because it's the throne of God, nor should you do it by earth, for it's his footstool. Again, he's quoting from the Psalms, I think those are. Nor by Jerusalem, because it's the city of the great king. You shan't swear by your head, because you can't make one hair black or white. So he kind of, there's a break there between those sections. There's a kind of that sense of, you're not swearing, you shouldn't swear by God at all. You shouldn't, in one sense it's, well, no. You shouldn't take it in vain, we know that, but actually all of those things that you put in euphemism-wise, remember in Jesus' day, Matthew talks about the kingdom of heaven rather than the kingdom of God, and that's because he's being sensitive to Jewish sensibilities, where some of the Jewish population didn't like the use of God in any kind of just common marketplace kind of conversation, and we still get that today. Today in most Orthodox synagogues, they won't say the name at all, and even if they write down, they'll put G-D, because they don't even want to write the name. And so that was beginning in Jesus' day, where people were kind of heading towards that kind of style, so euphemistically they would introduce other words. So instead of saying by God, they would say by heaven, you see, or by the temple. And we see some of that reflected in the style of Matthew's writing, for instance. So there's that kind of that imprecation by heavenly things, and then there's the kind of things whereby which I can remember I can still think of his face and his name and everything else about him very clearly. The kid at my secondary school always used to swear on the grave of his mother, even though she wasn't dead, which I couldn't quite work out how that one worked. It's just the other thing we do is we take a very kind of, if you like, personally, it's wishing the bad on me, cross my heart and hope to die. And because Jesus is making the rather obvious point, you don't really change anything. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, because whatever more of these is of the evil one. We need to put the flow of Jesus' words into the context of the flow of the law. One of the things we sometimes miss as the Christian church is, we translate Torah as law, and that's because the Septuagint also translates Torah as law. But when the word Torah is used not of the Torah but just in general flow, more realistic, well actually I said just in the general flow, actually what the word means is the flow or the direction. It comes from the verb that's in part of the word Torah, can mean to point at something, it can mean to throw something, it can mean the flow of or direction of a river. So there is something dynamic about Torah or law. As you read it in its kind of more general use, what you discover is that it's whereas, if you like, when we think of law in the Greek and legal kind of context, we think of failure against the whole point, and we often say that you fail in one point, you fail against the whole thing. There is a kind of it's often translated in other contexts more like teaching or instruction, that it's kind of the guidance that if you try and live within, there will be times when you miss the mark, and then you get up and you keep going, and there are rules within the Torah for how you repair and get back on track and so on, as opposed to we put a stronger emphasis on this sort of one failure, all failure side of things. So there is a kind of a sense in which we hear Jesus' words in the same way. Jesus is very realistic about the world we live in and the complexities of it and people who treat information about you badly, but he wants us to try as hard as possible to keep things as simple as possible and to say it as we mean it. And it's interesting because, again, it's one of these things that is a constant area of debate in psychology. Jesus, in one sense, is kind of in one sense, he's kind of standing in line with the way wisdom speaks in Proverbs. If you remember in Proverbs, wisdom is personified, and Philo, as a Jewish theologian and philosopher, identifies the wisdom of God with the word of God, even calls it the firstborn son, even though wisdom is female, of course, in the Old Testament. But wisdom speaks and says, all the words of my mouth are straightforward. There's nothing winding or deceptive in them. They're all plain to him who understands, and right to him, to those who find knowledge. So that's the way, if you like, wisdom, which is represented in this personified form, is with God. And Jesus kind of, in one sense, is aligning himself with that. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. The thing I think I was coming on to, moving on to the person, the persona. In Jeremiah, he says famously, the heart is deceitful above all things. It's extremely corrupt, and who can know it? And what's it kind of I find really interesting as you look at this is there's a very clear statement in terms of purity, which is about integrity. But the discoveries of modern psychology is how much damage it does to the individual who is not honest. Put it that way. It also flows out and it damages those around us. The reason I perhaps put these emphases on there is very often that I'm not saying that the traditions we grow up in are wrong. It's just that when we only ever hear one way of looking at something, they're sometimes a little bit narrow. So I remember kind of growing up, it was almost, if you like, to not be telling the truth is just something that is abhorrent to God, which it is, but that's all you need to know. You don't need to worry about it. But actually, it's sometimes much easier to kind of engage with the secular world if you can also explain to them why it's damaging both to the individual and it's also damaging to the relationships and to society around them. My apologies, I'm in one of those modes where I keep jumping to new thoughts as I'm talking, but do you remember last time when we were together and we were looking at the whole way in which once the breakdown of sexual relationships kind of spills out? I saw a clip, a YouTube clip by a non-Christian who's a historian, looking at what happens when sexuality stops pursuing kind of good standards, if I can put it that way. And it was quite stunning as he just went through empire after empire, which just totally collapse when those things happen. And he describes through the process. And he then was putting up figures that had just been done in Northern America, so I think it's Canada and the US, where they had surveyed tens of thousands of single parent families, and he put up, you see, some of the consequences, not if you like of moral failure of the person, but to society, of how much it costs them once the family has broken down, if you see what I mean, and was just kind of highlighting the growth of it and just saying, so we are again on one of these same trajectories. We've seen it in history before. It's nothing to do with being censorious and wagging the finger. It's just that in the end the economics breaks down when you once and he said it almost always starts with men saying it's emancipation for women that they can have as many sexual relationships as they have, but really it's just because men want to have an excuse to not feel guilty about sorry, I'm just saying the way he put it, have all those relationships. And so he said, but actually women then end up with one of two consequences. You either get what happens in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, where it became free abortions for everybody, until such time as they discovered, of course, that we had the population growth was now declining, and to try and support a population, an economy that didn't have enough workers. So then they banned abortion, but then everyone was having children in single families, and it wasn't just the economics; it was the impact of those who grew up in those families, were not as together, they were not as creative. Saying it's not Daily Mail kind of finger wagging. It was just saying this is what happens. So there is a kind of a real consequence. It's not just kind of that God's upset. He's upset for a reason. He knows where these things lead, if I can put it that way. And there is a similar kind of thing here going on with the purity of heart. In one level, it's a standard that God sets and indicates to us He's not happy when we fail against it. But there is a reason why He's not happy, not just because He's somehow shocked that we might make up an untrue story or tell a lie about ourselves. He can cope with that. He's not that offended by it. It's because He understands what it produces, if I can put it that way. So as I was saying, the gap between the person and the persona is the way I tend to talk about it. Actually puts a massive strain on intrapersonal resources and interpersonal resources alike. In other words, the difference between what I'm telling you about myself and actually the truth of who I am is a drain on my inner resources, because actually it takes far more work to maintain the fantasy, to perpetuate it, if I put it that way, which becomes a mental strain and causes, you find untruth is at the heart of depression and all sorts of things like this. And of course it actually means that people know somehow after a while that they're not really engaging with you, and so they don't feel connected with you. It's not that your lie may have upset them, but something at a subconscious level just somehow knows it's not dealing with the real person. So relationships never bond tightly. And so these kinds of things you're beginning to kind of, oh, here we go. Oh, right. Just put all these up. They're all kind of, they're beginning to kind of emerge. So this is going back to the 1950s, I think it was, 1955. These two guys, which got referred to now as Johari window, which some of you will come across in work kind of contexts, where they sometimes try and get people to think about this. And it kind of highlights, there are things you know to yourself and you don't mind other people knowing about you. And so that they called that your arena. It's the kind of what's common to me, I understand it, and I don't mind that John knows all about these things. But of course there are things that I know about myself, but I don't particularly want to share, see? And so they use the term facade. That's where I would refer to the persona. I know who I am, but I'm indifferent because of, depending on my relationship of trust with you, I might be willing to let you know as much or little. But then, of course, into that facade comes the mix of where our insecurities and pride now start to project stuff that really is not true about us. So it's not just that we're hiding stuff, which is one type of lying, but now we start to kind of create that false image. And of course, we see the massive impact of that with social media, because social media is designed to allow you to promote an image of yourself, which is not really the same as the truth. And so this is a little kind of tool, and there are all sorts of little psychologist games you can do where you get words that you associate with yourself and others see about you, and you can put them into pots. But they use it in kind of coaching environments to kind of help relationships work better. But as I said, the bit that's kind of interesting is the area of the fact that there's stuff that is that we know about ourselves and we deliberately don't share. Sometimes we deliberately share something that's not true. The other side is that we have blind spots, and blind spots are often other people can see but we don't see. So they might try and tell us, but we refuse to. And then there are stuff that even other people don't see and we don't see, but they are still true about us. And in many ways, part of the job of growth in kind of emotional intelligence is described as actually getting to know what's in the unknowns. It's being more, it's allowing yourself to hear more realistically what your blind spots are from other people, and also being able to stand back and kind of almost get some of those revelations on what are the bits in you that drive you. And so I put it up just simply as that kind of illustration of this kind of tool is used all over the place to try and get the gap between the persona and the person narrower. And fundamentally, if you want to describe that, is the difference between when I use sophisticated language. It's what sophisticated means. The sophists could argue any position even if they didn't believe it, you see. So technically a sophisticated argument is an argument you don't really need to believe. It's just kind of plays with words and rings and ideas and kind of can get across what you want it to get across, if you see what I mean. And a huge amount of human interaction is that kind of interaction. It's got less to do with logic. It's got much more to do with manipulation and kind of obscuring and hiding and so on. So I found this interesting little thing. It was a quote by a kind of review that was done on a bunch of recent papers on what is now a major subject in modern psychology, which is called moral hypocrisy. So they actually referred to it, I think I don't know if it was the title or if it was a kind of subtitle, it's the construct of 1,000 faces. So moral hypocrisy they described as being a construct, it's something that we've bunched a whole load of stuff under it and given it a title. That's what they mean by that. But actually it's got so many different faces, and so here's the quote from this guy, I've got the picture of it. He says, "The entire field of social psychology could be called the science of moral hypocrisy." So what he's really saying here is the issue of this idea of people faking who they really are is so widespread and so common that everything that we do in social psychology, which is the psychology of how people interact, really could be considered as being part of moral hypocrisy, which is really about how people are faking who they are to other people. Does that make sense? So I suppose I'm wanting to kind of get across is not particularly profound, but is the kind of the absolute all-encompassingness of this as a problem. And so you think about so as you know, some of I find myself having these kind of conversations all the time because when I'm doing the sort of the secular coaching things I'm doing, which is the challenge to people as to whether they really believe what they're saying. And so it just as you start to realise how encompassing it is, you realise how these simple words of Jesus, let your yes be yes and your no be no, actually are having profound impacts both on the mental health of the individuals who are living in unreality, if I can put it that way, and are also deliberately deceiving people. And having to maintain that fantasy and keep track of it, because your brain is not put together to maintain a fantasy. Some people do it, but they really do go off with the fairies, if I'm not being too rude. In other words, they got so convinced of their own narrative that they really do, it's almost become their truth, if you see what I mean. But you know that they're just not dealing with the real world. More common is the people who are just trying to manage it for different reasons and who justify it. So when they did this review, it's just interesting, they came up with some simple 5 observations. They're not particularly profound, but it's just worth putting there. But I thought what's really interesting is that people who genuinely, so I've highlighted that, if you genuinely value morality and you make it a part of your identity, you're less likely to be hypocritical. In other words, you are less likely to let your yes mean no and your no mean yes. And that kind of goes in with one of the other things we're going to look at, I think it's a week's time or so, isn't it? When Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So if you genuinely hunger and thirst for righteousness, and there's an and, so you need to be hungry to be moral, and you need to actually kind of turn that into a part of your identity, so it actually matters to you. That's what I mean by identity. We all might like, I'm just giving away my likes. We might all like a jam donut every now and again, but that's not the same as making it part of your identity, But there will be someone somewhere who has made those things, and they really are important to them, having a jam donut every single day. So if we genuinely thirst for morality and we make it part of our identity, what they did find is we are less likely to be hypocritical in that sense of pretending to be something we're not. Those who are more hypocritical what they found is that their motivation is actually to do with the desire to look good, more than an internal desire to satisfy personal goals. I was hoping I could find the things online, but I didn't know quite how to look for them because it was on one of my audio books, and the trouble with an audio book is you can't always find the reference quickly. It's not like in a book where you can mark it on a page. But there has been a whole load of work done where there are some psychologists would say that it's very rare to find people who genuinely desire to be good. Actually, most people who say and even think they even sometimes con themselves that they want to be good. And the sad thing is, I've seen the statistics for Christians as well as so people who even call themselves Christians very often will steal money when they think there's zero chance of anybody else ever finding out. They've kind of created experiments which people don't realise allow people to cheat and do things, but it looks so secure that nobody would know. The people who say that they're one thing are actually doing the opposite, which is really sad. But it ties in with this thing, which is that kind of hypocrisy comes because really what they desire is to be seen as good, not to be good. And that's why it's really key. It has to become part of our identity. We need to both desire it, hunger and thirst for it, but actually it really is. So then it matters to me if I do it today or tomorrow. If you see what I mean. Apparently, creative thinkers are more likely to be hypocrites. And their comment was that creative thinkers use their creativity to concoct justifications for self-serving and immoral behaviour. And that is again this is a review of lots of research, and I've seen the various bits over the years. But actually, one of the things that is interesting is that the smarter you are, the more likely you are to stubbornly believe something that's not true. Again, it's being tested because the higher your IQ, the better you are at inventing plausible reasons to justify your position. Does that make sense? So even though you're wrong, you're just really good at inventing the reason why you don't need to change. It's a similar thing to that. So those who are a bit more creative can come up with a reason why it's okay for them that they did it this time. And the fact that I didn't quite tell the truth is not quite the same as if John was to not tell the truth. So if you think of yourself as a creative, we have to be realistic and weigh these things. Narcissists, well, hopefully none of us feel like we're one of those. It seems to come out of their sense of entitlement, that they excuse themselves for their failings. But here's an interesting thing: the more impacted you are, so more affected you are when you see someone doing something right, when you see someone behaving honestly, doing something outside and so on. You'll actually also find that you have a stronger desire. It's a bit like goes with the first one. It's just an interesting question. Does it really kind of impress you when you see it? Because if it does really impress you, you yourself are more likely to live that way. So anyway, as I said, this was really a roundup from last time. But it was just kind of saying purity in heart. Jesus touches on, well, sex is a huge, powerful thing that motivates us in all sorts of ways that we pretend it doesn't, but it does. And actually this issue of honesty is a huge thing. So although it's only a few verses, Jesus actually chooses two issues that we have constant areas of debate, which is how true am I to myself and to you, and actually how do I justify my kind of sexual desires, and how do I express those things in ways that either build or don't build towards God. So it's just that quick little kind of recap to kind of capture what we were thinking about last time. So now we'll get on to blessed are the merciful. So, good. Thinking. It's funny, but now we've got these cameras here, I consciously think differently about how I'm presenting. if that you probably noticed, but I used to be kind of friendly and chat to you direct. Now I kind of look at my online community.
And we stay very quiet.
And you stay quiet because you don't want to. Well, earlier I think you were saying your PIN number, John. Everyone knows it. So Jesus goes on. So you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't resist him who is evil, but whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other as well. I put that little note there. I didn't raise it last time, but it was true last time. I said the phrasing kind of implies that Jesus is referring to what's being taught rather than what was originally written. And do you remember how, as we've gone through these weeks, I've kind of been putting up bits from the rabbinic writings to show what was being taught about the subject. So we saw that when we were looking at the way that they were justifying, well, it's okay if you didn't really realise she was married, because you might have thought, and so that isn't the same as adultery. But if it was real adultery, you would be stuck in Gehenna, but you're not, because it wasn't, because you didn't know, she didn't tell you. That kind of sophistry we were finding in the rabbinic writings, you see. It was kind of as I say, it was kind of teenage logic. It's not what can I do to please the Lord, it's what can I get away with, if you see what I mean. And so the phrasing, you have heard that it was said, because of course it is actually written as well, but it seems that Jesus is referring to the way you've been taught. So he does quote what is written as he goes through, but actually we're going to see there is always context to the things he's saying. So give to him who asks, and don't turn away from him who desires to borrow from you. You've heard it said, this is jumping forward a few verses, I'm going to go back in a second, but it's kind of just jumping forward a few. You shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy, because this is a good example of what I mean. See, you shall love your neighbour is in red because it's actually written down, and hate your enemy is something that the rabbis were teaching. And they were actually teaching the two next to each other. So Jesus is actually addressing what is currently being taught in churches, if you think of it like that. You go to synagogue on Saturday, church on Sunday. If you turn up today, everybody's teaching this, and he touched on that when he was doing pure in heart. They were saying that Moses said you can't get divorced unless it's in immorality, but he used the phrase indecent matter, and in their sophistry, their cleverness with words, letting their yes mean no and their no mean yes, they said, oh really, it was indecent that was the key thing, so if she doesn't cook well, that's indecent, so you can divorce her. There's that kind of levels of sophistry. And now we get here, he says, you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy. Well, only the first half of that quote actually comes from the Old Testament. The other half comes from the rabbis. So this is what it actually says. This is what the Leviticus says: "You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbour as yourself. I am Yahweh." So that's what's written versus what was heard. This is actually taken. I was just saying. I was feeling quite smug about myself. It only took me 5 minutes to track this down online. I had a note in my Bible that this was somewhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I went and found a PDF which has got every single one that's been translated. You can just download it for free. I mean, I think that's amazing. You know, you think it was only a few years ago you could get books with all the conspiracies about the stuff that hasn't been translated. It's just, you know, you can get them all. Anyway, so I knew that there were comments in there, so I went and found them. So here's the Qumran Rule of Community, which is one of the first Qumran documents that was ever translated. So it's been around for a good long while, which is probably why I had a note in my Bible about it. So he commanded by the hand of Moses and all his servants. So this is what the rabbis are teaching, and all his servants, the prophets, that they may, it doesn't say you shall, but they can if they want to, love all that he has chosen, i.e. the children of Israel, which is what we saw in Leviticus. It says you should. And you should. It's not that you may, but you should love them. And you can hate all of those he's rejected. So it doesn't say that, but that's what they're teaching. That if you're not one of his chosen, okay, so because those he's rejected are everyone that he didn't choose. Does that make sense? And he chose Israel, so everybody else is not Israel. So you can hate them. And then it goes on, that's in column 1, lines 3 and 4 of the Qumran scroll. He says, you hate all the sons of darkness, each according to his guilt. And the context there, again, sons of darkness are the Gentiles. They're your enemies. So you can hate, it actually was an injunction to hate them. And these are the rules of conduct for the master in those times, with respect to his loving and hating. This is the conclusion part of this scroll. So it is, as the beginning of the conclusion is basically saying, so we've just been going through in the text above who you should love and who you should hate, and the world is divided into those two communities, and this of course is totally contemporary with Jesus. You know, the Qumran documents were sealed in 70 AD. This is the community that was out there, the Essene community, who have such a big impact on the early church. This is one of their foundational documents of how they see the world. And probably not just the Essenes, therefore, but probably crossing over into other kind of church traditions or synagogue traditions, is a division based on the fact that we are told we should love our neighbour. We've done a bit of sophistry where we said, so neighbour does that doesn't include the Gentiles. Neighbour is only, and even with God's people, it's only you can if you really want to love them. Does that make sense? So I'm just kind of again highlighting how this same flow of the way we use language is still continuing in the way that people think about it. So Jesus goes on, I say to you who hear, you should love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you. Oh, so this isn't Matthew now. This is from the Sermon on the Plain, but do you remember how we were saying in many ways Matthew's is the really well structured version of Jesus' ethical teaching right at the beginning when he starts working with the disciples. Luke gives a slightly more free flowing version, and he does it towards the end of the period when Jesus has been working with the 12. And so this is the version from Luke, but it gives us a little bit more context. So in the context of what Jesus means when he says love your neighbour, and he said you've heard it said love your neighbour and hate your enemies, but I said, let's go back. Where are we? But you should love your neighbour as your. Where are we? And hate your enemies. Jesus. Oh, I didn't put the verses in. That's not helpful. In Luke, we get a little bit more to it. So do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other as well. We're going to go back and see those that they are in Matthew. For the one who takes away your cloak, don't withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you. And from one who takes away your goods, don't demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, so you should do to them. And so, although we don't have that particular last phrase in Matthew's Gospel, which is why I wanted to include the Luke version, it clearly makes total sense in this context. When Jesus says, you know, the way you'd like others to treat, you should treat them. And he kind of he extends the teaching of the rabbis. We'll think of it more concretely later on in this series. I don't want to spend too much on it now, but just to highlight it, that actually the issue of loving your neighbour is really practical, and it is not at the excuse of being able to hate those. So Jesus actually adds, but you should love your enemies. He actually adds it to the Luke version, which is kind of implicit and obvious in one sense, and is in the Matthew as well. But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven. And again, Jesus captures something which, when you stop and think of it, I find so often is important to remind. It's like a pill that you have to keep giving people, even in church, which is, the thing is, we understand we're saved by grace, and it is the grace of God that has acted on our behalf, and he has taken the initiative, and whatever our response is, he's still the initiative taker. And it's not because we were particularly worthy of salvation. It's because actually there's something in God's love that actually sees something that probably isn't there. It's kind of, if you like, as part of his initiative over us. So we know that's what our salvation is based on, and we celebrate the fact that therefore it doesn't matter too much if I eat a kind of an oyster, and the Old Testament says don't eat shellfish, because actually that's grace for you. That's fantastic. My wife wouldn't mind if nobody was allowed to eat oysters in the world, but I quite like them, so I can go away. So the what was I just saying there? So that's right. And here it is again. We find it in the mouth of Jesus, which is that actually if we think about life experience, everybody lives under this huge blanket of grace the whole time. The world is doing the most awful and evil things, and we're very quick. And because actually we have biblical examples, but we're quick to assume that they're coming soon, if you see what I mean. We're quick to assume judgment is coming soon, if I put it that way. But actually very often it's been coming soon for quite a while, because somehow the grace of God just keeps making space. The sun keeps rising on those who don't really deserve it, in our mind, if you like. We do, but they don't. And the rains kind of fall on the fields of those that don't love God, just as they fall on those that do. And so there is something actually, as we stand back, where we know the truth and we live in the benefit of the truth of God's grace, and actually that he is merciful on us even if we don't necessarily directly deserve it. But we're very quick to kind of step into a position where the little bit of growth and moral growth that has happened in us is justification for why we deserve it and they don't, if that makes sense. And so we have this very useful kind of reminder right in the mouth of Jesus. We should pray for those who persecute you. Paul puts it beautifully, doesn't he, in Romans 10, where he kind of describes those who seem to be far off, but we really don't know, and he uses those who weren't a nation and provokes the nation that he chose, i.e. Israel, because God's grace is always including other people that don't really deserve it. So Paul really nicely expounds these words of Jesus. He makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. If we just go back, we've got Proverbs there. Proverbs, of course, because I've said this before, almost everything that Jesus teaches we find embryonically in the Old Testament. What he does is he draws attention to it and kind of raises its profile. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. And you will heap coals of fire on his head, and Yahweh will reward you. I put there, actually, that issue of heaping coals must be a blessing. And the thing I was just saying about how churches often we still want to go to judgment, is how often we take the very principles we're seeing spelt out here by Jesus in terms of what does it mean to be merciful. Blessed are the merciful. I so regularly hear them talk with all sincerity, with a nasty caveat to them, if I could put it that way. And this is one of those. I'm going to start with this one because this is an obvious one. Heat burning. So it's kind of ha ha ha. I mean, you if you want to go and look online, because I found I had a look earlier today, and Wikipedia points out multiple different ways that this phrase has been. And you'll find it's quite commonly, because coals are about judgment and burning. So heaping coals on their heads is you're making hell even more unpleasant for them. I'm just saying, not saying that we would all hold this view, but I'm just saying it's a view that has been held, that that's what this means. But I put there, it must actually be a blessing. There's a lot of debate because we've lost the context of that phrase. But Jesus, it's not. Jesus seems to be expounding this proverb, this verse from the Old Testament, when he says, going back, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. You'll heap coals of fire on his head, and Yahweh will reward you. Because actually, Paul does quote it as well. But he quotes it with this. The paragraph that Paul quotes it in starts with this: "Let love be without hypocrisy," and he finishes it with, "But overcome evil with good." And so the idea that, if you like, the heaping coals is really about somehow, because we treat them better than they deserve, their punishment is worse. It is actually kind of going back to that sort of thing, which is we don't really understand, if you like, that we live under mercy as well, if I can put it that way. We think that because our lives are a bit better than my neighbours, that somehow I'm getting what I deserve and they should get what they deserve. But the whole context of this is blessed are the merciful because they will receive mercy. It's actually a kind of a whole cycle. I can give mercy because I'm receiving mercy. The more I give mercy, the more I'm conscious of the fact that I live under it, if I can put it that way. So he says, if this is Paul speaking, obviously. So if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. In doing so, you will heap coals of fire on his head, but don't overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So the context here, therefore, is how can heaping coals of fire on someone's head, how can that be a positive thing, if I can put it that way? And you'll find that there are various ways of understanding it positively, and what we can't say 100% is that this is exactly the answer. But as I say, the context, particularly of Paul, is that it's not you being hypocritical. It's not me kind of saying, I look like I'm blessing you. Can you see what I'm saying? Because that would be love with hypocrisy. I look like I'm being nice to you, but in reality, I'm really storing up something bad for you. Does that make sense? I've seen something that tries to reflect more kind of Jewish style of thinking, which makes arguments based on the use of burning coals, which is that actually it stirs up conscience. So they're saying that it's not the physical. It's using a physical image to describe a mental process, and actually it challenges the person. It's like their head is made to think. It's like you're putting fires on the coal. It's like you're putting stuff into that makes them think about it, or whatever. The flip side is as well that goes back a couple of centuries now. It was thought that because they know that when in ancient cultures you tend to have central kind of fire locations, and people have to go and collect coals and take them to the home. And most of the world carries things with things on their head, but if you're carrying a hot container, it can be a little bit painful. That it's not that you do it for that reason, but that actually in blessing, sometimes you can bless people by giving them coals, but actually it's a little bit awkward for them to walk away with it. That's another possibility. There's these various ways of understanding the thing. But I think the kind of context, and as I say, as Jesus expounds that verse by do good for them, treat them well, is not to punish them, but to actually bless them. And that's really what I kind of draw out, because if you go back, I'm sure I had. Yeah, here you go. This is my. I'll do it in this order. No, I tell you what. I'll do it in the order I put it in. Because the reason I wanted to draw it out with this one and then go back was because again I've actually heard taught locally. I won't mention any names, but I have heard taught teaching on things like turning the other cheek, which is really about getting the other person in trouble, and that what Jesus was teaching was to find ways of resisting that look good but are really about getting the other person in trouble. I'm not going to say anything more, but I've sat there and listened to that on several occasions in different places. So it's quite popular, if I can put it that way. So the logic goes, you'll hear it that if a Roman soldier made you go 2 miles, because he was allowed to make you go 1, but actually the rules of the Roman army was they were in trouble if they made you go 2. So go to, get him in trouble. That's how the teaching goes. And I just say it says more about the human heart, if I can put it that way, because Jesus doesn't say, he's not forced you to go to. If I offer to take somebody and pack another mile, that's my choice. No one's going to get into trouble for that. Can I put it that way? But it's taught that way. It is taught that way. And turning the other cheek is because now they would have is the challenge there. It's not quite as negative as they say, but there's no real. It's an assumed piece of truth. We don't have any evidence for it. Is that that if someone hits you with the back of their hand, that's disrespectful to you. Whereas a slap is an invitation for you to fight back as an equal, and so they wouldn't want to do that. So you're kind of turning the other cheek is about kind of saying I'm your equal in a whatever way. And so all of these things are often given that little twist, if I can put it that way, which is that actually we're pretending we're being nice, but this is the total opposite of what Jesus has just taught. It's partly why I wanted to get. You know, he's just said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And now apparently he's teaching things which are basically what looks like you're doing good for someone are really about getting them in trouble. What looks like you're doing good for someone is really about heaping burning coals on their head. You can gloat about that tonight. Sorry, when you're sitting thinking, ha ha ha, they're going to get worse judgment because I did that for them. That would be letting your yes be a no again. It would be you being fake in terms of who you are. So it's totally out of flow. So you get why you'll get some things really annoy me, and this is one of the things that really annoys me. And partly it's because it's done the rounds, and loads of people think they're being really clever. Haha! I'll tell you what Jesus really meant. And in their cleverness, I think we've missed the real point. Anyway, so let's keep going. The thing that's kind of interesting here is the thing that Jesus kind of puts out with the issue of being merciful, and particularly he's illustrated with this thing of they're your enemy, but you treat them well. And I want us to think through a little bit about actually what does that do when we behave like that. And so I think I've mentioned this guy before. I looked through the presentations. I haven't put his picture up, so there you go. Not that anybody cares. Paul Zach is being referred to as the vampire economist. And the reason he's for that was that he was an economist. He then transferred into psychology, and he's done a lot of his work where he's literally taking people's blood while they're going through things with them, and they're looking at the hormonal levels in it. And he found that the very kind of clear, if you like, correlation between the way that oxytocin goes up and down in the body with opportunities for the growth of what we see as pro-social behaviour. In particular, he focused it on how it builds trust between people. So hundreds of companies, multiple thousands of people showing that little quote there, top quartile trust environment. So a company where people trust each other, people are 50% more productive. In the bottom quartile, and they have twice as much reported energy at work. There's a whole host of things. So he was just saying what is really good for the world, if it's really good for a person if they are surrounded by people and do work with people whom they have a good trust relationship with. But the thing I really wanted to get is in his taking of hormones, he started to establish a kind of a certain pattern to the way that the different hormones work in us. And actually, I've mixed that a little bit in my own way. So his demonstration of how the hormone responses can be built together to produce a lasting trust. You can actually take what he's done there and you can actually extend it, which helps kind of explain more generally how pro-social behaviour grows. So the reason I'm highlighting this is because actually there's a really good flow that starts with being vulnerable, which is if I treat my enemy well, it's very easy to say, oh, but then he'll think I'm really weak. You know, the kind of thing. I can remember as a child, there was a kid at my school, and I used to get, and he was very good friends with another lad who, when I'd first gone to the secondary, it was my primary school, I'd sat next to him and I used to get on well with him. But when this other guy moved in, he didn't want me to be a friend of this other bloke. So I need to be compassionate because he did come from a very broken home. You don't fully understand all of that when you're a kid. It's just I knew as we went into secondary school, and then his dad had committed suicide and did all sorts of things. So I can be compassionate in one sense, but I'm just telling you the story about he used to. If I was ever talking to this other guy, he would be really unkind, you know. And I remember thinking, well, how I can't fight back against him because he was quite tough, So I'll try and be nice, And you try and be nice, and he immediately turned it around into a mocking thing of, you're only doing that because I'll be worse to you if not. That's the kind of the bully's thing. And so you kind of go through this logic, so well, I won't be nice then anymore. But actually there is a benefit, as we will see. There is a possibility. And there is a possibility for the growth of something, which I think is very often is the subtext, which I think by the Spirit, because his knowledge of these things would be stuck at the at first century Judea level, but the Holy Spirit has quite intimate knowledge of how humans work, and therefore he gives Jesus things that have this subtext to them. And so, as I say, one of the things is then an unexpected kindness that's in a context of vulnerability can actually kind of kickstart a process by which pro-social behaviour. When psychologists use the word pro-social behaviour, what they really mean is behaviour whose altruism is a little bit beyond the immediate selfishness of the person. So if it's like we all know, because we've all had teenage kids, when they're being really nice, when they need a ride to somebody's house in the evening, see, that's not really them being nice. That is them being a bit manipulative. I mean, we love our kids, but that's what they're doing, isn't it? Pro-social behaviour is when they're doing it actually a little bit of it is actually beyond what's really needed just for the immediate benefit, if that makes sense. And so there is a kind of a sense in which pro-social behaviour, you can actually kind of see a cycle that kicks off. And I thought I'd talk it through. I'll go. I didn't have time to put slides together on this. It's just this week has been a really busy week. So we've got the launch event for the book on Exodus on Saturday, and various things. So I was running out of time, so I didn't put slides here. I'll just talk through it. But did I? I didn't. Oh yeah. Okay. Oh yeah. So here we go. Yeah, going back to Jesus, vulnerable kindness. But I tell you, don't resist him who is evil, but whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other as well. So I've gone back a little bit in Matthew, but just to kind of illustrating, it's all part of this. If anyone sues you to take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. Now, the thing that's going on here, both of those things, you are not demanding your rights. If someone, the things that Jesus is addressing is you have rights, but you can resist someone with those rights. But tell you what, don't. Now, why would Jesus say that? I'm going to stop and it's a really hard thing to do, isn't it? If someone's being unkind to you, and think, well, I can at least use the weight of the law to say you can't go any further. And this is why I said I think it's useful to see the idea of the law, the Torah, as a kind of a flow, which when it talks about you can fall short of it, you can miss the mark, there's a big chunk of that which is just, well, then get up again and keep going, if you know what I mean. So it's not a question of if I fail once, everything's disastrous, because this stuff isn't easy, just being really blunt. But Jesus gives examples where I could say, well, you've sued me, I hate the fact that you sued me. Not only do I hate the fact you sued me, but I hate you because you sued me. I think that was really unfair. And you took my coat, and I actually owed you more, which is why you took me for my coat. But the law says you can't take my tunic. The law says you can take this off me, but you can't take that. As a young guy who I every now and again cross paths with when I do the work I do in London, who had a company that was he'd started out of his Christian conviction. It was training people to give them employable skills from deprived backgrounds. He had contracts with the government for so many years. He had signed leases on office buildings and taken on staff requests and so on. And then on a whim, the government changed its funding. It was when austerity kicked in. And pretty much everybody who was in, they had big kind of central meetings. All of the people who were in similar situations to him played their rights card. Hold your rights. But actually he felt in his Christian conviction, and so sued the government back, if you see what I mean. He decided, well, I took these things, I took them in good faith, and so he paid off all his creditors. Or is it the right way around? Creditors, debtors, creditors. He paid them all off. Over the years, he paid them out by selling his house and covering all of those things, but was just kept the company going, which he's now kind of resurrected and is doing something with. And so that kind of thing, though, is not easy to do. This is what I'm saying. It's easy to stand on rights. And before we go into the hormonal flow, I just wanted to, again, it's an interesting thing that is beginning to get recognised, which is, in the Western world, morality has shifted to an emphasis on human rights. And you will often hear in the paper that it's become disconnected from the responsibilities that I might have, if that makes sense. And in one sense, this guy David was exhibiting that. His rights were he could kind of go and sue back the government, but also his rights were he could say to his debtors, or was it creditors? I'm looking for those. I always forget which way around it is.
Creditors are the one that you owe.
Yeah, so his debtors, the ones he owes. Yeah, his creditors. Yeah, he could have said to his creditors, "Go away, I've been bankrupt." If you know what I mean, and you can't have my house or anything like that. But because he had that kind of strong sense that actually morality is somehow linked into that place of our own responsibility, he didn't want to just stand on right. And I think there's something of that in what Jesus is saying, because he so clearly chooses a couple of things where the law gives you a certain right to say no to this. And what he's saying is that on the whole, if you owe and someone's suing you, because it's not, he doesn't say someone sues you spuriously, he says someone sues you, that means you do owe them. And you could say no, these are my rights, but actually try and live that way, live beyond it, if you see what I mean. And if anyone compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks, don't turn away him who desires to borrow from you. And it's an interesting thing. I remember I was only a teenager, and I'm not saying it was the right thing to do, but I always remember being challenged by that verse, because obviously you go through London and you will regularly get asked, and I remember the kind of the logic is, well, people are going to buy drugs, and so on. But I remember somebody else saying, quoting this verse, just said, well, what I try and then do is maybe give the person something that if they're saying they haven't got money for food, well, give them food. Then that's the, if you see what I mean. So I thought, well, I'll try and do it that way. I'm not. And the reality is now there's so many folks, it gets hard to be able to respond to everybody just being. But as a kind of a principle of let's try and give to him who asks. And I remember I was asked I was only about 20 when I first year I spoke at Spring Harvest on the main programme. I was 18. That's right, I was 18. So. And I got on because I'd had cancer when I was 15. You know how it goes. It's not. So I was on the main programme, and on the kind of thing, I told people this story, and I told them about how. So one of those occasions, I remember a guy at Paddington in the old days before it was New Paddington. Asked for some food, and I didn't say anything as he did, but I walked down to the McDonald's, and I bought some food, and I took it back, and I just gave it to him, and I didn't evangelise him or anything. But as I walked off, he shouted after me. I always remember it. He said, "You're a real Christian." So that was his kind of the words that came after. I thought, well, that's a nice testimony. Must have known it.
We had loads of bags of McDonald's.
Yeah, that's right. But anyway, so I shared this story, but I got a big negative response from people, if you like, if you see what I mean, going on from the floor, if you see what I mean. And I remember the guy that was sharing the panel with me, because it was a panel thing, he just said, "That's what's really interesting though." He said, a lot of folks who've just made your comments, you've done it on logic, if you see what I mean, and how and he said, but at least what Christian was trying to illustrate was he's wrestling with a verse. I make myself sound really virtuous when I tell these stories, don't I? So he's saying, and actually it's interesting because that's how I often see it. Is we may not get it right all the time. Sometimes the situations are just too overwhelming, but let's at least try and do the dynamic with reference and try and get hold of something that is in the meaning of what Jesus is saying. And so he makes it quite simple. If someone's asking you, don't turn them away if he desires to borrow from you. Now, I do understand, this is what people are driving at, is that actually there can be a place where there's a sense of entitlement. It's not actually about need and so on. And I don't think Jesus' simple statement is supposed to try and cover all of those things. But the point is it's something to engage with, to ask the question of, to see if actually there's a challenge to me to go a little bit further than I would go naturally in my own instincts. But in the context of of Paul Zach and his things on hormones, there's this strange way, as I say, I'm going to tell the story with challenge, because he starts with challenge. He's saying actually, and workplace often you have challenges. You've got to do something. So what happens just in the person when there's something you need to do is you get a little burst of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. I think we've touched on some of these things. So, in the morning when the sun comes through your curtains, your body says it's the morning. I'll give you a burst of cortisol because you need to get out of bed, you see. And what it does is it starts to keep you focused, it brings focus to what you're doing. It diverts blood cells towards the muscles rather than the brain to a degree, not hugely so, but a little bit, because you might need to actually physically do something. And as you take on a challenge, the next thing that happens is you get a little burst of oxytocin. And oxytocin we refer to as the kind of the love hormone. And as I said, what we found and what he showed is that prosocial behaviour really grows out of the excess of activity that is driven or initiated by oxytocin in this. So oxytocin has a whole wide range of use, like every hormone does. But one of the things that they're kind of saying in a general sense is genuinely loving behaviour. You will find it has this hallmark of kind of high levels of oxytocin in the triggering, and then that's kind of worked in, and we'll think about this in a second, that's then kind of worked into the memory of the person and the identity of the person. So when I get a challenge, so I've got a task that needs doing, so I've got to move a sofa, that's a nice easy task. And it's not surprising that most tasks are easier if you do them with somebody else. So because I have a challenge, I get a little burst of oxytocin, which means that I will feel more well disposed to the people around me. The well disposed, I'm using that in a very broad sense. So it doesn't mean that I look at John and think, well, he's a really good guy, which obviously I do, John, just so you know. But also it gives me the confidence to be vulnerable, and that's the next bit to note, because actually vulnerability is one of the things that can be an initiator, which is what Jesus challenges people to do in one sense. I.e. they're treating you badly, it's vulnerable to treat them well in that context, because you risk, as I found when I was at primary school, someone saying, you're only doing it because you're scared of me, you see, you're only doing it because you have to. It is a risk, isn't it, but actually you are more likely to behave in a vulnerable way with someone when you are going through a little peak of the production of oxytocin in you. And a lot of the number of hormones like oxytocin and serotonin is another, they're constantly being produced. It's much more to do with the way they burst and peak. So shortly after you get a challenge, because very often the challenge requires you to make an alliance to do something with you, like, so I need to move the sofa, so the cortisol gets blood cells going to my muscles, but actually also kind of very logically, it's kind of like, it would be a lot easier if someone helped you. So let's give you a quick burst, and so suddenly I'm now willing to be a bit more vulnerable. Is that making sense? And because I'm vulnerable, one of the strange things is that vulnerability, as long as the person's not a psychopath, will also produce in them a little burst of oxytocin in response. So because I'm vulnerable, say, actually I could really do with your help, John. See? John, who naturally is kind of very hard-headed in logic, and say, well, get on with yourself, I can't be bothered. No. Because I'm vulnerable, it kind of produces a little bit of well-being towards me. So he's more likely to want to help. And just to kind of complete this first cycle, and then we'll put it into a bigger context, is then we move the sofa, you see. Now, shortly after we accomplish it, what will happen is that same kind of flow that's produced will then produce a little burst of the serotonin. In fact, the light physical activity also is increasing serotonin. Now, serotonin is a neural enhancer. And so the neurons, the connections that you're making in your brain when there's a lot of serotonin there, are getting reinforced as being more important. So in the aftermath of having successfully moved the sofa with John, having felt good about it, because I hit that little high of oxytocin that made me want to be vulnerable, and actually my vulnerability created a little spike of oxytocin in John, so he wanted to actually help me, and we did it together, and we succeeded, and because we succeeded we got a little burst of serotonin. And actually, as we now talk and I say thank you to John, and we celebrate the fact that we did a really good job together, those thoughts are being they are being kind of hardwired by the serotonin as we think them. That makes sense? So now when the serotonin's gone down, it's left a stronger set of connections, which actually means that our relationship has built up a little tiny bit. Does that make sense? And so this is all quite modern. This has only literally been kind of shown in the last few years, but I'm actually fascinated by it because you can see how it works. and what I've done, and I took his model, which is basically what I've just described to you, was from his work, the thing he was looking in people's workplaces, the way this process worked. And I mixed it with Jonathan Haidt's model of how pro-social behaviour seems to grow from practicing well what at the beginning is often selfish, and it kind of grows beyond that. And so in Jonathan Haidt's model, here you go, you can be 100% human. There's an ever-increasing kind of circle of influence for the love hormone oxytocin as you move from kind of primitive and solitary forms of life towards more social animals. So you can, what do I mean by that? Is if you look at as I said, every hormone has multiple reasons. And so if you look at lobsters, lobsters are really aggressive. So they're not pro-social at all. They're the opposite. They're antisocial. Lobsters are antisocial creatures. They don't like having friends, apart from if they're having them for dinner. That's okay if you're a lobster. Yeah, I really like my friends. They taste great. So if you ever go into a kind of a lobster restaurant, you look in the tank. They're all floating around next to each other, casually, but they've all got rubber bands on their snippers because otherwise they'd be snip, 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 and chopping each other up. You see, because that's the way they are. So obviously that is a problem because you know, a big, large male lobster will get the best spot on the seabed. It's a problem when it comes to mating, as you can imagine. And I tell the story just to kind of put the whole thing into the cycle. So the female lobster suddenly hits that period where she knows it's time she needs to mate. So she has a problem because if she approaches a potential mate, he will probably chop her up. Because he's bigger, and eat her. So she buzzes down when he's not looking, and I apologise for saying it in this context. When I tell this story in a secular context, people laugh, but she actually squirts by urinating into his thing. But actually, all of the lobster equivalent of oxytocin, which is called isotocin, is in, and so it wafts in there and it gets into his bloodstream, and suddenly he's feeling a lot more pro towards her, you see. So now she approaches, and instead of chopping her up, he kind of welcomes her into the lair, and then she has to become very vulnerable because she sheds her shell, and they obviously then he gets the eggs fertile, and he protects her while her shell regrows, you see, from other lobsters. So if you like, what's happening is in this really antisocial creature, this is what I'm saying from lower creatures, the basic use of oxytocin was to kind of create enough pro-social behaviour, enough connection between the two that they could actually get through the mating ritual. And then she buzzes off and lays her eggs, and if he sees her in a week's time, he will chop her up. And if he sees the babies, he'll eat the babies. You know, it's the way it goes. So that's what I mean by lower. As you kind of move up, what you find is that the role of the hormone becomes more sophisticated, and the more social animals get, the more kind of the more layers it kind of uses. So once you get to kind of to mammals, what you tend to find is, it can produce longer sense of bonding between the couple. It will also create better feeling towards even in the male towards its own offspring. Not always. You know, some hippos will kill their own male offspring, but most of the time it does. But all the time what you're seeing is, as the more social the creature gets, the more roles oxytocin has within the psychology of the creature in terms of making it more pro-social. And so Jonathan Haidt uses this little phrase, which is that humans are 90% chimp and 10% bee. And what he means by that is, if you look at chimps, because we are kinder than chimps are. That's where the 10% bee comes from. Chimps are actually bond with their whole pack, but as he said, those ties that bind the pack often blind them to the other, so they will kill somebody from another pack. I don't know. Chimps, it's not a pack, is it?
Troop.
It's a troop. Yeah. Chimps will kill kill another chimp from another troop, but they will be quite pro their own troop, if you see what I mean. And actually, part of that is the role of the oxytocin in it. And it grows in the young males, particularly as they go in through the process of starting to mate and have their own children. They start to then recognise the value more of the troop, and they honour it and so on. But fundamentally, it's still selfish, if I could put it that way. It's fundamentally still selfish. It benefits me and my family and my group. Does that make sense? Humans are able to kind of think slightly wider. We can take on bigger and bigger groups. So we can feel positive and we can develop those trust relationships with people who aren't quite like us, but then they become like us. And that's part of the process. So as I go through those tasks where I take the risk and you respond to the risk and we achieve something together and we lock that in and we start to actually create a sense of a group that's bigger and bigger. Is that making sense? So that's the kind of the model he puts. I kind of modify it a little bit to say that actually I like to say we're 100% human. That means we're 80% chimp, which is because we're tribe-ish. We're 50% bee, which is we're colony-ish. But we're also 5% angel, which is altru-ish in this kind of sense. Because actually one of the things that's interesting, although Haidt doesn't go there in his analysis, he gives plenty of evidence of how if you practice well the things that are kind of, if you like, produced by this oxytocin flow, I mean, it keeps on extending the group. And then he gives illustrations of people who do totally altruistic things for people who are right outside and they will never get any benefit from, and that's the end of it, but they still behave those ways. And at that level, although it's not common, even amongst kind of Christians or whatever, it's still not a common phenomena, but it is there. And in one sense, it highlights the kind of that most abstract of loves, the kind of the agape. I will actively work for people that I get no benefit back from, and it's not selfish. It's kind of self-giving rather than self-serving. But one of the things that's interesting is that the kinds of things, the kind of, if you like, life that you need to get to acts of real altruism are the kinds of life that you get from having a religious community, i.e. kind of a church life. Because it's in those contexts that you kind of practice the cycles that actually are teaching me trust beyond what the people who look immediately like me, who talk like me, who are like me, etc., etc. And so he does actually illustrate that very often it is religious folks who are often the most often the kind of expressors of it. It's not unique, but it is often those kinds of people. And that's probably because of this sort of cycle. So we're getting near the end of what I wanted to kind of really present out of this, because the context of blessed are the merciful, because they shall receive mercy, the way that Jesus actually unpacks it is to do things that are surprising. They are treating people in ways that they wouldn't expect you to, because they know how they're treating you badly, and then you're suddenly treating them better. Well, there's some vulnerability in that. It gives them an opportunity. It doesn't mean they will, but it gives them the opportunity to respond differently, if that makes sense. Gives you the opportunity to actually build a relationship and actually stretch yourself in terms of the kind of the size of the community and the diversity of the community that you're able to relate and kind of get on with. And that is, if you like, the foundations of how good loving behaviour extends itself. That makes sense. It's still true, even in Christian circles, that we find it easier to serve those that we know will serve us. If I can put it that way, which it can be self-serving. But actually, if we're going to do it the other way around, it probably will grow, because we're doing that quite regularly. I do this 9 times. I help John, John helps me. Do that 9 times, and I'll actually go and help the person down the road who's not going to benefit me at all, and I don't even get the benefit of everybody in church knows I do it and what a nice person I am. That's more likely to happen as we put these other things into practice. And so, although it can sound, again, it can sound like in extreme ways, like I said with the previous one, that purity of heart, actually the things Jesus touches on, actually cause the ends of civilization. As kind of as actually the rules around sexual congress kind of blur to total liberty, civilization falls apart. Actually, as if you like, issues of personal integrity and yes and no's, and actually my security with being able to share with others, the more unreal we become, the more the fabric of society falls apart. It's part, I think, of the whole phenomenon that we have at the moment of fake news, is because no one trusts each other. And part of it starts with the yes is yes, no is no. And then the issue of how we're going to break that, how we're going to change that. Well, actually, those who now are my enemies, because we've all fallen apart, someone has got to take the initiative and act with kindness and vulnerability because they may have to do it 50 times before they get the positive response. But the point is, if they never do it, they never get the positive response. So if it's going to be healed, if it's going to kind of grow out from somewhere, it's going to be part of that dynamic. And my hope is, as I say, I don't think I've necessarily been that clear tonight, but it's part. This is for me, is one of the kind of bits where I as I read, and this is why I wanted to do something like this, as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, and because of the things I do in a secular context, where I have to look at the psychology and teach and coach people with the psychology, thinking actually this is quite profound if you actually that in one sense it's very easy because we've been taught to do it, so we just do it, and the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it kind of logic. But I've never been a great fan of that. I always want to try and understand a little bit be underneath. I'll take it because I'm not going to say the Bible says it, so I'm going to try something different to see if I'm better. I'll live with it, but I always want to know why. If you know what I mean. And as I say, I think you can. I'm starting to kind of say, okay, I can see this. I can see why Jesus puts it this way. I can see why this is important, not just a kind of as a good idea, but really is important. If I can you go say something, John? You look like you're about to.
You read me. That vulnerability, if you take it to a conclusion, surely must bring peace.
Yeah, I think vulnerability is always a part of peacemaking, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's actually, vulnerability is something that happens in loads of human interactions and transactions. Whenever you have a cooperative relationship, there is a bit of vulnerability in asking for help, because you are saying, I do need your help.
There's a chance to say no.
And there's a chance that the person can turn you down and so on. So doesn't have to be big vulnerability, but actually just that little one. And as I say, what I found was fascinating is that vulnerability is one of the things that's going to create little, in a normal person, because you can get people who are, I can never remember whether it's a psychopath or a sociopath, which way around it is, but who don't get any response in a hormonal sense. But in a normal person, it creates a little bit of a hormonal burst in them, which is likely to produce a better response from them. And if we succeed in it and we get the serotonin burst and we communicate about how well we did it together, it leaves me better bonded.
I've heard somewhere along the same lines, that basically if you do agape love, do what the Lord says, or if you do that to someone else, or in that situation yourself, in obedience, whatever, you get a serotonin hit, shall we say. Or if you observe someone doing, like someone helping somebody across the road, or something like this, or you see someone doing good in an agape sense, you will get a serotonin hit. So we are hardwired to be rewarded with a happy hormone when we actually do what we said. Whereas most of the world works the other way around. And tries to get happy by doing stuff that's wrong. And if we just do what is right, we get the happy hormone.
And that goes back to that slide I put right at the beginning. Do you remember where it said those who are most affected, not effected, but affected. In other words, it has an emotional response by seeing kind acts, seeing those gracious acts, are the people who are most likely not to be hypocritical in the way that they kind of project something that they're not. So I think it's probably that similar thing is what you're talking about.
I'm one of these people who read and do from a checklist sort of thing. The Lord says, do this, and okay, well, I better do that then, even if it's against my fleshly inclination. But it's interesting that we are hardwired to be rewarded for doing that, whereas the world tries to gratify itself the opposite way round, and obviously it doesn't get the satisfaction, doesn't get the satisfaction.
What it gets is like we said in the first sessions, with it gets the buzz, but a dopamine buzz from the same source you become immune to, so you stop getting it after a while. But your hunger grows for it, so you've got a hunger for something that won't satisfy you if you.
Well, if people get into conflict and what have you, and not being merciful. I mean, take for example the Shamima Begum case. So the Lord challenged me about this. He says, what's your attitude to that? Because So I kind of thought, okay, what is my attitude to that? So actually, when I did it prayerfully, I thought, actually, I feel sorry for her. Okay, the decision was made. It's out of my hands, but the Lord was challenging me. Okay, what's your heart? You got your heart right on this one.
I find exactly the same with that case. And it's a good illustration of what I was trying to say about is you try and engage with the question with the Lord, because so I found myself in this thing saying, from a logic point of view, I can see that you must have rules that must have consequences, and actually that's true for rules of community and rules of society, and society breaks down without those things. So you have to draw them, but they're not the same as rules for salvation. They're not, if you like, an absolute locking of someone in. So you've always got this tension of trying to, therefore, that I think is a really helpful, the way you put it, Howard, which is the way perhaps I'm reinterpreting what you're saying, is it's important that as part of that we have a thinking dialogue with the Lord, if you like, rather than just a legal one, if you know what I mean. Even if we end up with the same conclusion that we might have done if we'd taken a purely legal point of view, but that question of what's going on, how are you doing it, what things mitigate in other ways, because they are part of that bigger picture. But we find verses, and there's a famous bit in one of, I say it's famous, I remember it. There's a bit in one of the Simpsons episodes where Ned is trying to make a decision, and in his head he's got verses he can think of from the Bible that say do one thing, and stacking out over here, and a smaller stack over here the other way. So, I mean, and actually that's part of very often the way it goes, isn't it? We kind of think, oh, I've got this verse and that, but that's part of the process, which is that real life is often the tension of conflicting truth, rather than one is true and one is wrong. So and actually, sorry, I was going to do some of this tonight, we didn't really do it, but that mercy is only mercy when the law is clear. And one of the problems the West has is they when we say we want the law to be merciful, then the trouble is it's no longer law. So I've been really unkind to John. This is John this time. Sorry, I'm being really unkind to both of you tonight, but it's just the way it goes when we talk about. So I've really upset John, you see. So he takes me to court, and they go, yeah, you know what, he really upset you, but we're merciful, so you've got to forgive him. Okay, you've got to forgive him is not forgiveness. You know what I mean? That you only know mercy if you know the standard that an eye is worth an eye. He stole my car, he ought to replace my car. It's only mercy in that context when I make a choice to say that's what he owes me, that's what the right is, but I am choosing to do something different, which is part of what Jesus puts here, if that makes sense. I can remember a thing, and this is part of the tension we were talking about, is when you think of something like the begging case, you have to have certain rules. Are they being fairly applied? How does that work? What would grace do? You're asking all of these kind of questions, which is you have to have a certain rule. But the problem with the modern world is that it sees if mercy is not entrenched in law, but once it's entrenched in law, it becomes a right. It's no longer a mercy. It then sees that as, well, you can't have that, that's too human, that's open to abuse, so you're not allowed to do it, so we have to put it. But the trouble is you get this situation which happens the world over, which is when you start to go down that route, eventually you get to a point where people don't trust the law anymore because it doesn't actually deliver. And I remember a really well-made documentary back in 20-something years ago, it was done, called Revenge, and over 6 weeks they did 6 people who had been totally let down by the law, so therefore took revenge into their own hands. Now, I wouldn't be standing up advocating revenge, but you watch the documentary and think, I know exactly why they did that. I can't say that if I wasn't in their shoes, I might not have wanted to do exactly the same. Does that make sense? Because actually it's a different thing for me to find grace because the Lord has been gracious to me, to say, the law says this, you should pay me back, but I'm not going to hold on to it. For my own sake I will forgive. That's what the Lord says. It's amazing, isn't it? For my own sake I'll forgive. That it's good for me, so I choose that. But that's different from saying, no, the Lord says you must forgive him. He may have hurt you, he may have killed your child, but you're not going to have any punishment, because that would just be vindictive and nasty. So it's not, that's not, now it's not given because of the flow of mercy and grace, it's given as a right. Does that make and so that's also part, I think, of this tension.
Also, it's the attitude of our heart, isn't it? So the Lord says, right, you want me to have mercy on you, Howard, therefore shouldn't you have mercy on Shimei and Rebecca?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And that's right. It's what
one's wrestling with these verses, and we've got a real life situation where something horrible is happening,
Yeah.
How do I feel? I remember the C.S. Lewis teaching in Mere Christianity year, and I first got saved years ago. Read it, but he was speaking in context of wartime radio broadcasts he was making. He says if you hear that the enemy's committed some atrocity, and it makes you angry and all the rest of it, but then a couple of days later it feels that it actually wasn't quite as bad as it was made out to be, and in fact it wasn't as bad. If you still want to feel angry and hateful towards your enemy at that point, so that'll make a devil of you, is his expression.
Yeah.
So you're challenged now to
can you let go of it?
Let go or not? Just I remember it was a very simple, instructive sort of thing. Okay, do you want to hold on to that? Do you want to still hate Shimmy and Begin for doing something stupid and getting brainwashed into doing what? So it's.
There's an interesting thing again. I can't quote you sources now, but which I've looked at, where they reckon that while the time varies, they reckon that after 3 months, almost any atrocity you have the ability of letting go of emotionally. That doesn't mean to say that if you remember it again, it won't still hurt you and upset you. But the difference is that. So in other words, what they're saying is it seems to be hardwired into the human psychology. And it's also true the other way around. There's nothing great that will happen to you that unless you're really proactive about it, you'll still feel great about in 3 months' time. So in other words, you have to remind yourself, if you like, and that's not a bad thing, to remind yourself of what you're grateful for. And the funny thing is that you hear that, and I thought, I know that's true, because I have this most incredible story, which is not my doing, of getting healed overnight from a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But I totally know that I've lost, if you like, the sense of thrill from that unless I proactively get it out and polish it up. Does that make sense? And they say that the same is also true, it seems. But if we continue with it, it's because actually we haven't been able to let go of getting out and reworking it effectively. Now, you want to say that carefully because you don't want to land people on things that people struggle with. Because what they're not saying is that doesn't mean to say if you have every now and again you might remember something and you'll think about it and you'll feel the pain of it. That's part of the deal. What they're saying is it doesn't have to control you. That seems to be it's almost like we're made in a way that enables us to both, in those different ways. Anyway, and I was going to say, C.S. Lewis here makes that wonderful point where on forgiveness he says if you think forgiveness is easy, you haven't got anything to forgive. I always thought that was a really I've had to tell that to myself so many times. I can't forgive. Well, actually, that's why you need to forgive, because if it was easy to forgive, if you could forgive, then there probably wasn't a reason. There wasn't anything much to forgive. It's the things that are hard that are the ones we have to do.
I suppose the interesting thing is that you have to forgive from your decision of your will, not of your feelings. Your feelings are hurt, aren't they? So I've seen people healed like this, where I've said, right, okay, they've come with a problem, and I said, right, well, and it was to do with cursing and other stuff like that. But then I won't go into all the details. But essentially, we've got the person to, right, if you'll just speak out of your mouth by a decision of my will, Father, I choose to be obedient to you. And I said, well, name all the people that were involved here. And so they spoke out, and I said also, now the Bible says, Jesus said, bless those who curse you. So will you just do the same thing again and bless everything? Just speak it out of your mouth and make a decision and bless everything. Bless their house, bless their money, bless their dog, bless their duck pond, whatever. Just speak a blessing over it. Next day they were healed. Yeah.
No, it is a very real. I mean that's another whole thing, because they're finding more about that. But I always remember one of my earliest. Sorry, I didn't finish that sentence. The issue of actually what you articulate actually lodges in you far more than if you just think it. So saying things out loud actually solidifies it. But I always remember as one of my earliest answers to prayer, before I had cancer, when I was kind of like going through this thing of, do I want to be a Christian or not? I could kind of reach the mature age of 14, and be made to go to church, and now I can choose to sleep in, and my parents won't fight with me too much on a Sunday morning under do I want to or not. So that before I had the cancer. And I made a commitment at Spring Harvest. I mean, they do what would happen is I decided I wasn't going to be a Christian, and I'd go, and then you'd hear someone preach the gospel, and I always found I had to stand up and go forward. It's just annoying. And but then the guy, John Allen. So I remember the name. If anyone remembers that name, he wrote a few books. who'd been speaking. He finished the whole thing about responding to Jesus. He then finished with that, the verse which actually was in here, which actually in fact just come to, I think, isn't it? Oh no, it's not. Oh, I didn't put the last verses in. Okay, I didn't put the last slide in. Very final verses of this in Matthew 5 are when Jesus says, even the Gentiles kind of love those who love them, and so on. And he said that, so forgive those who hate you. And so, I remember there's a kid at school who I really, really didn't like because it's a bit similar to what I was describing at primary school. This is now secondary school, so there's obviously something about me that attracted these things, and I really couldn't stand the guy. But the reason I always remember it is when I did get cancer a few months later, he kept coming to visit me in hospital, and I realised when we left school he was one of my best friends, if you know what I mean. And the thing that I'd said is, the guy had said, so when the guy I prayed with said, when I said I don't know if I can, I can't forgive him, he said, well, so think of it like this, is the way he put it. He said, so he got me to pray, Lord so-and-so, I know you love so-and-so, but I don't. But I give you permission to love him through me. So that's the way he did it with me. You know what I mean? And so I prayed that prayer, and I think a lot of it is this permission thing, is what Howard's driving at, which is that you emotionally you can't do it. But what you do is you're effectively given permission by the words you use to the Lord to actually love through you, in that sense. And that's where the transformation kind of comes. So that now we're talking about that process of forgiveness, but in the kind of the wider thing here, what I wanted to get, I suppose, is that if you look at what goes on in the world, and they can go back hundreds of years or even thousands of years, is at the end, if they're ever going to break, we have to be living very really the principles here. Now, I can't go into the middle of into Palestine and create reconciliation, because I've not gone through those things. All we can do is, in our own situations, we try and live these things, model them, share them, demonstrate them, because fundamentally there will always be a story where someone taking vulnerability, laying down their lives, laying down their rights, creating the bond that is unequal in how it came about. It cost one person more than it cost the other, but once you're doing that, you don't worry about that. And that is actually the story of how reconciliation can grow, and you can see it's a fragile thing. I think we've seen that a little bit in South Africa and places where there's a remarkable thing in the early days with genuine sort of love and relationship, but as time goes on, the old things start to bubble back, because it requires that active salting and lighting with this kind of behaviour, which is why I'm saying, you can't go into the middle of one situation unless God's told you that's your calling, that you have nothing to do with, and just go around saying, hey everybody, I forgive you, I'll be nice to you, because it's false, it's not your thing. All we can do is, when it happens with us, we try and model it, develop a testimony with it, pass that on to someone else, hopefully they will do the same.
That's being salt.
And that's what I'm saying, it's the salt and lighting, and they will try and live those same ways. So that's really why I ran out of, and I didn't even get those last verses on, which I should read, shouldn't I? So, if you love those who love you, what reward is that? It's what the tax gatherers, they do the same. If you only greet your brothers, what more do you do than others? Even the Gentiles do the same. So you be mature as your heavenly Father is mature, or you be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And there's that wonderful kind of final phrase. As I say, the word can be perfect or mature, but I prefer that sense of mature. It's kind of almost it's the challenge to us to kind of grow up into something. And when I say growing up into something, I think therefore we be realistic that it's not natural. When I say no, it's not where we are to start with. It's not where we start. It's where we're growing towards. It's kind of let's grow towards those things. So people don't mind chipping in anyway. So it's good. No problem. If I say, does anyone want to ask or say anything else at this stage?